Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Subrata Mitra. I'm the director of ISAS. On behalf of the ISAS community, it's my very great joy and privilege to have with us Mr. James Dorsey, a distinguished speaker, distinguished colleague, and a much read and listened to speaker. James is a senior fellow at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, and he's the co-director of the Institute of Fan Culture at the University of Würzburg. I got it right.
Yeah? You did.
He's an award-winning journalist and a scholar, has covered and written about the Middle East for more than 40 years, and he has been based in 10 countries in the Middle East, so he should know what he's talking about, and North Africa, including Saudi Arabia and Iran. His book, The Turbulent World of Middle East Soccer, is being published in April, and a second book, co-authored with Teresia Cruz del Rosario, Lost in Transition, Comparative Political Transitions in Southeast Asia and the Middle East, is also being published in April. A much decorated man. He's looking towards the three magic letters, PhD, and that would happen in March at the University of Utrecht.
Thank you. Well, thank you.
Yeah. Now, as the topic goes, James will enlighten us about a problem that affects South Asia deeply. After all, our institute, an Area Studies Institute, is also part of global trends that affect our area, and that's where Islam and Wahhabism comes in. My colleague, Professor Riaz Hassan, who is from Pakistan but is based in Adelaide, has done a statistical survey of it. According to him, by 2017, India's, or was it 2030, and according to the Sacha report, India would have the largest number of Muslims in the world, and South Asia, of course, with Bangladesh and Maldives and Pakistan thrown in, is one of the largest catchment areas of global Islam, and the topic in that sense cuts deeply into our mandate, and I'm very grateful to James for making himself available for this talk. And the giveaway sentence in the abstract that has been circulated is very important for us for this talk. He's talking about a single largest dedicated public diplomacy campaign in post-World War II world, which has cost $100 billion. These are not PPP dollars, but real dollars, which means in terms of their firepower, they're a lot more. That's the kind of monies that empower this campaign. That's all very good, but there is a context to this particular lecture, and I have James's permission to share that with you. Why is a think tank holding a conversation like this? This topic could very well be a topic for doctoral research. It could be certainly a media event, but in a think tank, this does and this should acquire a different configuration, and that is the takeaway from here. James and I were sitting next to one another in a workshop with the rather unpleasant title, Do We Still Need Think Tanks? And of course, coming from a think tank,
which was chaired by Tess.
It was a little close to the bone. And the conversation went on, and this is how it was passed across. What is a think tank? Why do we need a think tank? Think tanks are like fish tanks or goldfish tanks. Why do you have one? Well, everyone else has one, and it feels good to have one. So what do? Like goldfish, their job is to make useless knowledge appear useful. And the punchline, you can't eat goldfish. So the person making this argument went on to say that what they do is to be a storage tank which uses information and evidence-based research to produce knowledge which is really useful. At that point, I look at James, and James looks at me, and we said, we have to do something serious about it, and this talk today is part of it, because he brings to this topic. Now look, I've been a political scientist for the 43 years of my career in various universities, I've rarely shared a podium with a person who combines intellect, analysis, deep experience, and a facility to pull it together in terms of what do we do next. So far as our stakeholders are concerned, the government of Singapore, the ministries, the governments of South Asia, and the civil society, as well as the world of business and entrepreneurship, this is the kind of conversation where we have the possibility of finding some indicators of what can we do about it, what can be done about it, what is the analysis-based policy recommendation. So that's the kind of takeaway which gets me as director of ISAS very, very keen to listen to James and very grateful for your making yourself available. James will speak for about 40 minutes. I'll give him a signal because we want to have a lot of time also for a conversation afterwards. James, you have the floor.
Thank you. And can everybody hear me? Yes. Okay. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for a very generous introduction. Let me just put one caveat on it, if I may, and that's the principle of Socrates: the more you know, the less you know. There's long been discussion and debate about the longevity of the Saudi ruling family. In fact, when I first visited Saudi Arabia 40 years ago, my initial conclusion was, this can't last. Obviously, so much for my predictions, but I still would maintain that statement, even though I think that obviously my timeline has changed significantly. And obviously, the Saudi monarchy has demonstrated far greater resilience than many were willing to give it credit for. One of the major reasons for the doubts about the Al Saud's viability is obviously the Faustian bargain that they have made with Wahhabism. Basically a Puritan, intolerant, discriminatory, anti-pluralistic interpretation of Islam. It's a bargain that has produced the single largest dedicated public diplomacy campaign in history. Nothing compares with it. Not what the Soviet Union did in the days that it did, not what the United States did in terms of public diplomacy. The estimates of Saudi spending on the funding of Muslim cultural institutions across the globe and the forging of close ties to non-Wahhabi Muslim leaders and intelligence agencies in various Muslim nations that have brought into significant elements of the Wahhabi worldview range anywhere from $75 to $100 billion. The campaign is an issue that I have looked at since I first visited the kingdom, during numerous subsequent visits, when I lived in Saudi Arabia in the wake of the 9/11 attacks, and during a 4.5-year court battle that I won in 2006 in the British House of Lords. It's an issue that I am now writing a book about, and I'm looking at the fallout of the Saudi campaign in 4 Asian countries, 1 African country, and 2 European countries. The campaign is not simply a product of the marriage between the Al Sauds and the Wahhabis. It is central to Saudi soft power policy and the Al Saud survival strategy. One reason, though certainly not the only one, that the longevity of the Al Sauds is a matter of debate is the fact that the propagation of Wahhabism is having a backlash in countries across the globe. More than ever before, theological or ideological similarities between Wahhabism, or for that matter its theological parent, Salafism, and jihadism in general, and the Islamic State in particular, are under the spotlight. The problem for the Al Sauds is not just that their legitimacy is wholly dependent on their identification with Wahhabism. It is that the Al Sauds, since the launch of the campaign, were often only nominally in control of it, and that they have let out a genie out of the bottle that now leads an independent life, and that can't be put back into the bottle. That is one major reason why I argue, and I'll do so in greater detail in these remarks, that the Al Sauds and the Wahhabis are nearing a crunch point, one that will not necessarily offer solutions, but in fact one that could make things worse by sparking ever more militant splits that will make themselves felt across the Muslim world and in minority Muslim communities elsewhere in multiple ways, including increasing sectarian attitudes in countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. Some of you may have noticed that yesterday a prominent Saudi cleric was shot in the southern Philippines. The Israeli and the Saudi press are describing the area as a Shiite stronghold, and obviously blaming the Iranians for the attack. I'm not sure that the description, but Tess is a better judge on that than I am, on whether that part of the Philippines really is a Shiite stronghold. It's, as I understand it, a much more contested area. But nonetheless, if indeed the Iranians were involved in this, it would, I think, mark a serious escalation in what is something between a covert and an overt war between the Iranians and the Saudis, and increasingly risks becoming an overt war. Let me, however, first take a step back and to paint a framework in which the Saudi campaign should be viewed, in my view. For starters, one has to realize that while it may be one pot of money, the goal of the campaign differs for different parties. For the Wahhabi ulama, it is about proselytization, about the spreading of the faith. For the government, it's about soft power. At times, the interests of the government and the ulama coincide. At times, they diverge. By the same token, the campaign on some levels has been an unparalleled success. On others, success is questionable, and one could go even a step further to argue that it risks becoming a liability for the government. It may be hard to conceive of Wahhabism as soft power, but fact of the matter is that Salafism was a movement that had only sprouted minuscule communities in the centuries preceding the rise of Ibn Abdul Wahhab, and only started to make real inroads into Muslim communities beyond the Arabian Peninsula 175 years after his death. By the 1980s, the Saudi campaign had established Salafism as an integral part of the global community of Muslims and sparked greater religiosity in various Arab countries, as well as the emergence of Islamist movements and organizations. The soft power aspect of it is certainly in relation to the power struggle between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and it has paid off, particularly in countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, where sectarian attitudes and attitudes towards minorities are hardening. Let me illustrate this with an anecdote. The man who was until recently deputy head of Indonesian intelligence and deputy head of Nahdlatul Ulama, one of the world's largest Islamic movements that professes to be anti-Wahhabi, is a fluent Arabic speaker. He spent 12 years in the Middle East, 8 of those in Saudi Arabia as the representative of Indonesian intelligence. This is a man who will profess in the same breath, in the wake of the attacks, I think last month in Jakarta, his dislike of the Wahhabis, but also warned that Shiites, who constitute 1.2% of the Indonesian population, and that includes the 2 million converts over the last 40 years, he will describe them as the largest domestic threat to Indonesian national security. The success of the Wahhabi and Salafi proselytization is such that NU is forced to adopt Wahhabi language and concepts. In recent contacts between NU and the Saudis, NU, a proponent of what it describes as a tolerant version of Islam, proposed an agenda that was topped by a discussion about the threat posed by Iran and by the Shiites. Wahhabism's proselytizing character served the Al Saud's purpose, as they first sought to stymie Arab nationalism's appeal and later that of Iran's Islamic Revolution, both tectonic developments that promised to redraw the political map of the Middle East and North Africa in ways that potentially threatened Saudi Arabia's rulers. Both developments were revolutionary and involved the toppling of Western-backed monarchs. Arab nationalism was secular and socialist in nature. The Islamic Revolution in Iran was the first toppling of a U.S. icon in the region, and moreover, it involved a monarch. The Islamic Republic represented a form of revolutionary Islam that recognized a degree of popular sovereignty. Each in their own way posed a threat to the Al Sauds, who cloaked their legitimacy in a religious puritanism that demanded on theological grounds absolute obedience of the ruler. Ultimately, the Saudi campaign benefited from Arab socialism's failure to deliver jobs, public goods, services, and the death knell to notions of Arab unity delivered by Israel's overwhelming victory in the 1967 Middle East War, during which it conquered East Jerusalem, the West Bank, the Golan Heights, and East Jerusalem. Moreover, Egyptian leader Gamal Abdel Nasser's early rupture with the non-Salafist Muslim Brotherhood led many brothers to join the stream of migrant workers that headed for the Gulf. They brought their activism with them and took up positions in education that few Saudis were able to fill. They also helped create and staff organizations like the Muslim World League, initially founded to counter Nasser's pan-Arab appeal. The campaign further exploited opportunities created by Nasser's successor, Anwar al-Sadat, to find himself as the believing president. Sadat, in contrast to Nasser, allowed Muslim groups like the Brotherhood and the Salafis to re-emerge, create social organizations, build mosques, and found universities. The rise of the Brotherhood in the kingdom sparked a fusion of the group's political thinking with segments of the Wahhabi and Salafi community, but also accentuated stark differences between the two. Saudi establishment clergy, as well as militants, took the Brotherhood to task for its willingness to accept the state and operate within the framework of its constrictions. They also accused it of creating division or fitna among Muslims by endorsing the formation of political groups and parties and demanding loyalty to the group rather than to God, Muslims, and Islam. The Saudi campaign was bolstered by the creation of various institutions, including not only the Muslim World League and its multiple subsidiaries, but also Al-Haramain, another charity, and the likes of the Islamic University of Medina. In virtually all of these instances, the Saudis were the funders. The executors were others, often with agendas of their own, such as the Brotherhood, or in the case of Al-Haramain, more militant Islamists, and perhaps even jihadists. Saudi oversight was non-existent, and the laissez-faire attitude started at the top. And again, let me give you an example. The National Commercial Bank, when it was Saudi Arabia's largest financial institution, had a department of numbered accounts. Only those accounts belonged to members of the ruling family. Only 3 people had access to those accounts. One of them was the majority owner of the bank, Khalid bin Mahfouz. Khalid would get a phone call from a senior member of the family who would instruct him to transfer money to a specific country, but leave it up to Khalid to who precisely in that country would be the recipient of the money. In one instance, Khalid was instructed by Prince Sultan, the then defense minister, to wire $5 million to Bosnia. Sultan did not indicate the beneficiary. Khalid sent the money to a charity in Sarajevo that in the wake of 9/11 was raided by US law enforcement and Bosnian security agents. The hard disks of the foundation revealed the degree to which the institution was controlled by jihadists. In one instance, the Saudis suspected one of the foundation's operatives of being a member of Egypt's Islamic Jihad. They sent someone to Sarajevo to investigate. The investigator confronted the man and said, "We hear that you have these connections, and if so, we have to part ways." The man put his hand on his heart and denied it. Only later in a court statement to describe how easy it was to fool the Saudis. It took the Al-Qaeda bombings of 2003 and 2004 in Saudi Arabia, rather than 9/11, to persuade the Saudis to really take control by banning charity donations in mosques, putting the various charities under a central organization, controlling the transfer of funds abroad, and working with the United States and others to clean out some of the charities, or like in the case of Al-Haramain, to close them down. The problem is that by that time, it was on the one hand too late, and on the other hand, the soft power / proselytization campaign still served a purpose. Let me start off with the purpose. The Saudi campaign shifted into high gear in the wake of the 1973 oil crisis that left the kingdom flush with cash. It allowed King Faisal to pay back a debt to the ulama for their support in his rivalry with King Saud. But more importantly, it was an important tool in countering the appeal of the 1979 Islamic Revolution in Iran. I want to dwell for a little bit on the Saudi-Iranian relationship because it is a key driver of Saudi Arabia's soft power strategy, not only then, but also today. Underlining the Saudi-Iranian rivalry is what is, from the Saudi perspective, an existential battle that is sharpened by uncertainty about the kingdom's relationship with the United States. U.S. officials for much of their country's relationship with Saudi Arabia have insisted that the two countries have nothing in common, no values. All they have is common interests. Underlying the now cooler relations between Washington and Riyadh is the fact that those interests are diverging. The divergence became evident with the eruption of the popular revolts in the Middle East and North Africa in 2011, and particularly U.S. criticism of the Saudi military intervention in Bahrain to squash a rebellion, and hesitant American support for the toppling of Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak. It is also obvious in the U.S. persistence in reaching a nuclear agreement with Iran that is returning the Islamic Republic to the international fold, despite deep-felt Saudi objections. The result of all of this has been, with the rise of the Salmans, King Salman and his powerful son, Deputy Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, a far more assertive foreign and military policy. Make, however, no mistake, Saudi Arabia's new assertiveness is not a declaration of independence from the United States. On the contrary, Mohammed bin Salman made that very clear in a recent Economist interview. It is designed to force the United States to re-engage in the Middle East in the belief that it will constitute a return to the status ante quo, U.S. support for the kingdom in the belief that it is the best guarantor for regional stability. The Saudis appear to be operating on the basis of Marx's Veränderungstheory. It's got to get worse to get better. That is part of the backdrop of the stalled military intervention in Yemen, Saudi moves in Syria, and credible sources most recently suggesting that the ongoing multinational military exercises in the kingdom may be a stepping stone for Saudi intervention in Iraq to counter Iranian-backed Shiite militias. To be clear, Saudi government leaders, in contrast to Wahhabis, do not necessarily hate Shias, so much as that they see them as an Iranian fifth wheel and a tool for countering Iran by motivating Sunnis to fear and resist Iranian influence. Anti-Shiite sectarianism helps Saudi Arabia mobilize both Muslims to take up arms as part of the kingdom's struggle with Iran for regional hegemony. Saudi Arabia has repeatedly accused Iran of fueling sectarianism by backing Shiite militias who have targeted Sunnis in Iraq, Yemen, Lebanon, and Syria. The Saudi allegations notwithstanding, a recent Carnegie Endowment for International Peace study concluded that the anti-Shia rhetoric was much more common online than anti-Sunni rhetoric. Fact of the matter is that Saudi Arabia had real concerns in the immediate wake of the Iranian Revolution. The fall of the autocratic pro-US regime of the Shah made place for a regime that was revolutionary and keen on exporting its revolution to the Gulf. Iran made no bones about it. I remember the headquarters of the Islamic Liberation for Bahrain being located in the living room of Ayatollah Hussein al-Montazeri. The revolution, not Shiism, was what Iran hoped to export. It took, however, less than a year for nationalism to trump revolution in Iran. The process was accelerated by the Saudi-backed Iraqi invasion of Iran and the 8-year-long bloody Iraq-Iran war, which together with the soft power campaign marked the beginning of a largely covert war that has been ongoing now for almost 4 decades, despite periods in which relations between Saudi Arabia temporarily improved. The Saudi determination to counter the Iranian revolutionary threat by defeating rather than containing it has ever since shaped Saudi policy towards the Islamic Republic and towards Shiites. To be sure, Iran repeatedly took the bait, with the creation of Hezbollah, political protests during the Hajj in Mecca, the 1996 bombing of the Khobar Towers in Saudi Arabia, just to name a few of the incidents. Nonetheless, much like the Al Saud's Faustian pact with Wahhabism, the kingdom's handling of relations with revolutionary Iran was certainly to ultimately backfire and position the Islamic Republic as an existential threat. Rather than embrace its Shiite minority by ensuring that its members had equal opportunity and a stake in society, and countering discriminatory statements by the clergy and government institutions, the kingdom grew even more suspicious of Shias, who populate the country's oil-rich eastern province. In doing so, they provided Iran with a golden opportunity to forge closer ties to disgruntled Shia communities in the Gulf. Middle East expert Suzanne Maloney predicted that the most important variable in the stability of states with significant Shia minorities, such as Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Pakistan, will be the overall tenors of these states' domestic politics, particularly on minority rights issues. A Kuwaiti Shiite businessman who visited Tehran shortly after the 1979 toppling of the Shah saw the revolution as opening the door to a new era. We are citizens of Kuwait, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia. We are Shiites, not Iranians. What happened in Iran is good for everyone. It will persuade our governments to treat us as equals, the businessman said at the time. It was an attitude that was manifested in the fact that up to 1 million Shiites died in the Iran-Iraq war, defending Iraq against Iran. The businessman's words went unheeded. Instead of acknowledging legitimate grievances, the kingdom accused Iran of interference in its internal affairs and those of its allies. It relied on autocratic minority Sunni leaders to keep a grip on majority Shia populations in Iraq and Bahrain. Saudi leaders further failed to recognize that Tehran's perception of itself as Shia central was no less legitimate than Riyadh's insistence that it was Sunni central, or Israel's claim that it is the center of the Jewish world. As a result, the 2003 U.S. invasion of Iraq that brought the Shiite majority for the first time to power left the Saudis incredulous. To us, it seems out of this world that you do this. We fought a war together to keep Iran from occupying Iraq after Iraq was driven out of Kuwait in 1991. Now we are handing the whole country over to Iran without reason, Saudi Foreign Minister Prince Saud al-Faisal told an American audience in 2005. Similarly, the perceived Iranian threat to Saudi dominance prompted Saudi Prince Bandar bin Sultan, for decades a key player in the shaping of Saudi security policy and the kingdom's relations with the United States, to warn Richard Dearlove, the head of the British Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, already more than a decade ago, that the time is not far off in the Middle East, Richard, when it will be literally God help the Shia. More than a billion Sunnis have simply had enough. As recently as October 2015, a Saudi TV host, Abdullah al-Dosari, celebrated uncontested the death of some 300 Shiite Iranians, including Iranian diplomats, in a stampede during the Hajj in Mecca. Praise be to Allah, who relieved Islam and the Muslims from their evil. We pray that Allah will usher them into the hell for all eternities. The Saudi approach created the seeds for intermittent domestic unrest and repeated tit-for-tat attempts to weaken and undermine the legitimacy of the other. It set the stage for a global effort to ensure that Muslim communities across the globe empathized with Saudi Wahhabism rather than revolutionary Iranian ideals, and with Saudi support for Saddam Hussein's 8-year-long bloody war against Iran, which poisoned relations over the last decades. The poisoning of those relations was evident in the will of Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, whose anti-monarchical views were rooted in the oppression of the imperial regime of the Shah that he had toppled. Muslims should curse tyrants, including the Saudi royal family. These traitors to God's great shrine, may God's curses and that of his prophets and angels be upon them, Khomeini ordained. The execution of Nimr al-Nimr in January was not simply designed, as many analysts maintain, to send a message to domestic opposition, nor was it simply intended to send a message to Iran. The message, "Don't mess with me," has long been loud and clear. The execution was part, in my view, of a deliberate strategy to delay, if not derail, implementation of the nuclear agreement and Iran's return to the international fold. Iranian hardliners played into Saudi hands with the storming of the Saudi embassy. It's the hardliners that Saudi Arabia failed to strengthen in last week's elections in Iran for parliament and the assembly of experts, the council that eventually will elect Iran's next spiritual leader. The strategy makes perfect sense. Saudi regional leadership amounts to exploitation of a window of opportunity, rather than reliance on the assets and power needed to sustain it. Saudi Arabia's interest is to extend its window of opportunity for as long as possible. That window of opportunity exists as long as the obvious regional powers, Iran, Turkey, and Egypt, are in various degrees of disrepair. Punitive international sanctions and international isolation long took care of Iran, and that is what is changing. Iran may not be Arab and maintains a sense of Persian superiority, but it has the assets that Saudi Arabia lacks: a large population base, an industrial base, resources, a battle-hardened military, a deep-rooted culture, and a history of empire and a geography that makes it a crossroads. Mecca and money will not be able to compete, and certainly not with Wahhabism in control. And that may prove to be Al Saud's second existential challenge. I would argue that increasingly the domestic foreign policy and reputational cost of the Al Saud's marriage to Wahhabism is changing the cost-benefit analysis. Visitors to the kingdom in the 1990s would see the slogan of progress without change plastered all over the place. Fact of the matter is that change today is more than ever the key to progress. Tumbling commodity and energy prices are forcing the Saudi government to reform, diversify, streamline, and rationalize the kingdom's economy. Degrees of change are already obvious with the cutting of subsidies, the raising of prices for services, the search for alternative sources of revenues, and moves towards a greater role for the private sector and for women. Cost-cutting is occurring at a time that Saudi Arabia is spending effusively on efforts to counter winds of political change in the region, not only with regard to its new military assertiveness, but also with massive financial injections into regimes like that of Egypt that have yet to perform. Reduced income, cost-cutting, and reform will ultimately change the country's social contract that promised cradle-to-grave welfare in exchange for a surrender of political rights and acceptance of the pact with Wahhabism and repression. Reform that enables the kingdom to become a competitive 21st century knowledge economy is difficult, if not impossible, as long as it is held back by the strictures of a religious doctrine that looks backwards rather than forwards, and whose ideal is the emulation of life as it was at the time of the Prophet and his companions. Saudi Arabia was shell-shocked on September 11, 2001, when it became evident that the majority of the perpetrators were Saudi nationals. Saudi society at the time was put under the kind of scrutiny the kingdom had never experienced before. The same is some ways happening again today in the wake of the execution of Sheikh Nimr and the rise of the Islamic State. The Saudis expected human rights criticism. The criticism goes in one ear and out the other. What they didn't expect, fueled by the emergence of IS, was that the focus would be on Wahhabism and Salafism itself. As a result, the cost is beginning to become perhaps too high, as Saudi Arabia finds itself increasingly compared to the Islamic State, and not unfairly. Wahhabism in the 18th century and at the beginning of the 20th century, with the creation in 1932 of the Second Saudi State, was what the Islamic State is today. Saudi Arabia is what the Islamic State will become should it survive. Saudi clerics, despite their denunciations of IS as a deviation from Islam, admit this. Adil Kalbani, a former imam of the Grand Mosque in Mecca, was unequivocal. Daesh, the Arabic reference to IS, has adopted Salafist thought, he said. It's not the Muslim Brotherhood thought, Kutubism, Sufism, or Ash'ari thought. They draw their thoughts from what is written in our own books, from our own principles. The ideological origin is Salafism. They exploited our own principles that can be found in our own books. We follow the same thought, but apply it in a more refined way. Mohammed bin Salman summed up Al Saud's dilemma when he told the New York Times in November, "The terrorists are telling me that I'm not a Muslim, and the world is telling me that I'm a terrorist." One can question the effectiveness of the Saudi soft power effort on multiple levels. True, the Islamic Conference Organization recently backed Saudi Arabia in its conflict with the Islamic Republic, but only 4 countries broke off diplomatic relations with Iran following the storming of the Saudi embassy. All 4, Bahrain, Djibouti, Sudan, and Somalia, were dependent on the kingdom. None of the other Gulf states did so, although some lowered the level of their diplomatic representation in Tehran. Only the move by Sudan had had more than symbolic value. It threatened to disrupt Iranian logistics in the region. Similarly, the Gulf states have followed Saudi Arabia in advising their nationals not to travel to Lebanon because of Hezbollah, the Shiite militia. Nonetheless, the potential risk of Wahhabism and Salafism's identification with the Islamic State or at least as a breeding ground for more militant and more violent strands of Islam, is increasing. Two of the major political parties in the Dutch parliament recently asked the government whether there was a legal basis for outlawing Wahhabi and Salafi institutions, schools, academies, social services that are funded by Saudi and Kuwaiti institutions. The question arose as a result of graduates of those institutions increasingly refusing to interact with Dutch society, and allegations that a minority had joined IS in Syria. The government has yet to respond to the questions. But nonetheless, imagine a scenario in which the government did move to a ban that would likely be challenged in the courts, and imagine that the ban would be upheld in the courts. The next step would be the banning of Saudi funding, and ultimately the expulsion of the Saudi embassy's religious attaché. It's not a development the Saudi state can afford. The Al Saud's risk was also evident late last year, when German Vice Chancellor Sigmar Gabriel, in a rare attack on Saudi Arabia by a senior Western government official while in office, accused the kingdom of financing extremist mosques and communities in the West that constitute a security risk, and warned that it must stop. We have to make clear to the Saudis that the time of looking away is over. Wahhabi mosques all over the world are financed by Saudi Arabia. Many Islamists who are a threat to public safety come from these communities in Germany, he said. Changing international attitudes towards Saudi sectarianism and the fighting of proxy wars against Iran are evident in a quiet conclusion in Western intelligence and policy circles that the crisis in Syria is in part a product of the international community's indulgence of Saudi propagation of Wahhabism. CIA Director John Brennan unsuccessfully tried in 2011, as peaceful anti-regime protests in Syria descended into violence, to persuade Saudi Arabia at a meeting of Middle Eastern intelligence chiefs to stop supporting militant Sunni Islamist fighters in Syria. An advisor to the Joint Chiefs of Staff recounted that the Saudis ignored Brennan's request. They went back home and increased their efforts with the extremists and asked us for more technical support. And we said okay. And so it turns out that we end up reinforcing the extremists. In sum, the complex relationship between the Al Sauds and Wahhabism creates policy dilemmas for the Saudi government on multiple levels, complicates its relationship with the United States and its approach towards the multiple crises in the Middle East and North Africa, including Syria, IS, and Yemen. Historian Richard Bulliet argues that Saudi King Salman faces a difficult choice. Does he do what President Obama, Hillary Clinton, and many Republican presidential hopefuls want him to do, namely lead a Sunni alliance against the Islamic State? Or does he continue to ignore Syria, attack Shias in Yemen, and allow his subjects to volunteer money and lives to the ISIS's caliph's war against Shiism? The former option risks intensifying unrest, possibly fatal unrest, in the Saudi kingdom. The latter contributes to a growing sense in the West that Saudi Arabia is insensitive to the crimes being carried out around the world in the name of Sunni Islam. Prediction: in 5 years' time, Saudi Arabia will either help defeat the Islamic State or become it. The Al Saud's problems are multiplied by the fact that Saudi Arabia's clergy is tying itself into knots as a result of its sellout to the regime and its close ideological affinity to more militant strands of Islam. Madawi al-Rashid, who's among us, argues that the sectarianism that underwrites the anti-Iranian campaign strengthens regime stability in the immediate term because it ensures a divided society that is incapable of developing broad grassroots solidarities to demand political reform. The divisions are enhanced by the regime's promotion of an all-encompassing religious nationalism, anchored in Wahhabi teachings, which tend to be intolerant of religious diversity. Dissidence, therefore, centers on narrow, regional, tribal, and sectarian issues. The knots are also evident in approaches towards Syria. A Saudi royal decree banning Saudis from granting moral or material support to groups including the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda's official offshoot in Syria, the Al-Nusra Front, was countered more than a year later by a statement of more than 50 clerics that called on Sunni Muslims to unite against Russia, Iran, and the regime of Bashar al-Assad. The statement described the groups fighting the Assad regime as holy warriors, in what was finally widely seen as an endorsement of jihadist groups. By the same token, Saudi Arabia's intervention in Yemen in a bid to defeat Houthi rebels, the only group to have challenged al-Qaeda's advances in the country, but that also threatened to undermine the kingdom's dominant role in Yemeni politics, has effectively turned the Saudi Air Force into the jihadist air wing as al-Qaeda expands its reach in the country. Whether Bulliet is right or not in his prediction, Wahhabism is not what's going to win Saudi Arabia lasting regional hegemony in the Middle East and North Africa. In fact, as long as Wahhabism is a dominant player in the kingdom, Saudi Arabia is even less likely to win its battle for hegemony. At the end of the day, it's a perfect storm. The stakes for Saudi Arabia are existential, and the kingdom may well be caught in a catch-22. Thank you.